Hi, I'm Michael, and this series presents a deep dive into a secret that I've been keeping for most of my life, but one that should never have been kept at all. It's my hope that learning my secret and the insights it has given me will help you understand either your own secrets or those of at least one person near to you. These audio episodes were originally recorded and released as a single 7.5 hour long video on YouTube. That video was really just me talking to the camera, so other than a few title cards, one thumbnail, and some body language for context, you're not really missing anything by listening rather than watching. Either way, you'll hear my message. That said, I only got asked to make an audio version after the original video was completed and released, so please understand that this introduction, my spoken trigger warnings, and the episode structure and breaks have all been hacked and hammered in after the fact, and please also excuse the few references to this video and the thumbnail. I don't think there will be anything too confusing in audio form, but if there is, a link to the original video is in the show notes. Also in the show notes will be links to any references and resources I mentioned in this episode. There are 8 episodes in total. Please only listen to them in order, as that order has been very carefully and very painfully chosen. This is episode 4 out of 8, my second education. It discusses progressively worsening mental health in a child and early teen, and includes incidents of re-victimization involving sexual and physical violence, including sadism and masochism, descriptions of intentional self-harming behaviors, and severe depression progressing towards suicidal ideation. Hi, I'm Michael. And by the time my parents divorced in 1985 and my mother moved us back to the small town in British Columbia where she'd grown up, I had developed CPTSD, which, because it had been intertwined by years of childhood neglect with a parent-induced eating disorder, might also be called DTD. It wasn't the most severe case. I didn't yet have the full dissociative symptoms and all the extra complexity that brings with it. And if it had been given the sort of careful professional support that can, with enough money and knowledge, be accessed today, it was probably still treatable, even if it was likely only ever going to be manageable rather than curable. Unfortunately, I wasn't going to find any of that support in Abbotsford, British Columbia. Instead, I was going to discover just how much damage a child with CPTSD can do to their self, especially when raised in a community full of adults that are pathologically incapable of supporting children. The following passage contains brief descriptions of intrusive thoughts and suicidal ideation. I had a lot of mood swings, difficulty forming relationships and trusting, especially with men and boys for obvious reasons. And I had some seriously negative ideas about myself, notably an unbearable amount of shame. I also had tremendous anger that I didn't know how to control at all, and it manifested as a lot of very violent thoughts that had been alien to me before my first day of school and which were very graphic and disturbing. I now know this to have been part of my still developing hypervigilance, but at the time they were just horrific, unbidden thoughts that I couldn't control or moderate. They would intrude any time I felt either frustrated or scared by someone else, and I was scared by someone else essentially all of the time. That was especially true at school, where my growing weight and odd behaviors, especially my hesitancy to use urinals and school toilets with other boys or men present, led to quite a bit of bullying, which in turn led to even more intense thoughts of escalating violence aimed at others, but also at myself. I'd already started to suppress and try to avoid those thoughts. I wouldn't talk about or express them because of the shame I felt. That shame had built over the years because of the intensely negative reactions both my mother and my female teachers had had to drawings I'd made and other ways I'd expressed myself after my first day of school. With several decades of experience and hindsight, I now recognize those drawings as both my attempt to communicate what had happened to me and to recapitulate the violence I'd experienced, but because I didn't get heard, and it was clear the exploration of violence wasn't going to be acceptable or safe, those impulsive thoughts morphed into compulsive, violent shame. That shame was amplified by an overwhelming desire to simply not be like my father, who had grown violent enough towards my mother and me that he was just about to vanish completely from our lives. Something he did, he told me years later, because he had realized he wasn't going to be able to control his own impulsive, violent thoughts more than he had been much longer. Unlike him, I couldn't simply eject myself away, and so I'd had no choice but to learn how to suppress my increasingly violent rage on my own while still a child. For better or worse, I had figured out that I did have two ways of doing that. First, I could swallow at least some of the anger and violence by literally swallowing more food, by stuffing my rage into my body as extra fatty tissue. It'd be years before I learned that cortisol, the main hormone involved in both the acute and post-traumatic stress responses, is fat-soluble. But by the time they divorced, I'd watched my mother's example long enough that I knew I could numb those intense feelings and the thoughts they drove by the simple act of pushing my weight up higher. That added fatty tissue added a chemical buffer between my brain and my rage. Second, I had realized quite early on that I did actually have a very crude and very dangerous ejection mechanism. I don't remember precisely when I first started to understand that suicide was something a person could do, but I do know that it wasn't very long after the first time a woman registered disgust at a drawing I'd made of violent things. To protect others from what felt, even then, like a disease that had somehow corrupted me, had made me dangerous, I installed my own trigger mechanism. Though I didn't yet have the knowledge or means to actually do it, much less a specific or actionable plan, my mind had decided it would kill my body if it ever moved to act on the violent impulses that it kept throwing up in front of me.
The following passage contains descriptions of the experience of triggers and flashbacks.
Over the years, I'd also developed what I now know and recognize as triggers and flashbacks, though at this point my triggers were seemingly random and could be essentially anything, while my flashbacks were so overwhelming that they didn't provide imagery yet, just intense emotions that would leave me screaming in rage and striking out violently towards objects. Always objects, never people. I had enough control to direct my intense internal violence only at external things, but what my mom eventually called my episodes would leave me physically exhausted and even more shamed at the end because I damaged someone else's property, which for some reason was always considerably more important to the adults around me than the damage I'd done to my own hands. Sometimes these episodes were bad enough, I'd only realize I'd come out of one when I was standing, shaking, fists balled and my left foot screwed up, with no knowledge of how I'd gotten there or how much time had passed. I had nothing like the understanding I do now of what was happening to me. No words or language, much less precise terms for any of this, and that left me unable to communicate what was happening. My inner world was unbearable, but also, quite literally, unspeakable. So I simply thought I was crazy, and that I had to figure out, myself, how to control that crazy. Because all anyone else was doing was punishing me or shaming me for being abnormal. None of the adults around me, including those who ostensibly had responsibility for me, were doing anything to teach me how to either control my emotions or control the outbursts of violence that my body had when those emotions overwhelmed me. Instead, what they taught me was how to use chicken wire and spackle and plaster and paint to repair the walls I'd damaged. The only useful, actionable advice or guidance I was ever given was how to literally hide the evidence of the war inside behind a superficial veneer.
The following passage contains a brief description of body dysmorphia.
On top of what, in hindsight, were the bright, blood-red flags of PTSD induced by childhood sexual abuse, the violence of my weight fugoid, which had continued after my parents divorced, had left me with a very severely distorted body image. In the very few photos that remain, I was pudgy, not enormous, not unrecoverably obese, just a bit above average for my height and slowly edging towards more than a bit. But I thought and believed that I was morbidly and disgustingly obese. My father had cut off affection when I was 5. My mother Not long afterwards, after I inadvertently flipped some sort of a social taboo switch that shut off affection based on my height rather than my age or maturity. And as I got older, my reactivity and emotional tantrums discouraged anyone from touching me. So by the time we'd moved to Abbotsford, I truly believed that I was, in a word, untouchable. Untouchable by men and boys was fine. My first day of school and my father's belt had eliminated any possibility I would ever be able to endure or desire any kind of physical contact with males without feeling abject, unreasoning terror. But untouchable by anyone was never going to be bearable. We are fundamentally social animals, and the human body needs affection and contact just as much as it needs food. Starve it of either long enough, and it will do anything to get what it needs. Well, by the summer after I turned 15, I hadn't been touched in an affectionate and loving manner by another human being for most of the years I'd been alive. When I say untouchable, I mean that in my mind, anyone that touched me would be demeaning themselves, that they'd be lowering themselves to touch something filthy. At 50, I'm sorry to say, I still have to actively fight every day to resist that thought. Back then, it meant that I'd have compromised or negotiated my safety in any way imaginable if someone had just been willing to hold my hand. Just think what that does to a child. Being starved of food and then starved of affection, all because they'd made the mistake of getting on the wrong bus in front of the wrong man. And I was still very definitely just a child. At 15, puberty, genetics, and the fugoid had left me somewhat bigger than most of my classmates, and I did look a little older than my years, but my world was still plastic toys, G.I. Joe, Transformers, comic books, and cartoons. Except for in certain specialized, walled-off, secret areas, I was as ignorant and naive as any child, maybe even more so since I'd been forced to skip and truncate whole developmental stages along the way. I knew that I was desperate for physical contact and affection, but I'd also been left completely clueless on what that even meant or with whom, if anyone, it was supposed to happen. I knew that it wasn't going to be boys. That avenue had been cut off in the most violent manner possible, and men utterly terrified me. While I'd always found girls pretty and intriguing, I also thought of them as soft and vulnerable, as the other kind of young victims of male violence. I couldn't risk hurting someone else, especially someone good, without hurting myself first. That was the trade-off I'd made to hide the violence brewing inside. That left women, or at least what my still quite childish mind thought of as women, and specifically a woman who'd already been demeaned. Someone who would already somehow be prepared to touch something filthy, something just like me. Revictimization is what happens when the urge to recapitulate puts you in harm's way, when it compels you to take on risks that aren't sensible or safe in order to somehow unburden yourself of your trauma by reliving it, while still in the position of the recipient of trauma, of the one without power. Recidivism is what happens when the urge to recapitulate puts others in harm's way, when it compels you to put others at risk or make them unsafe, so you can somehow unburden yourself of your trauma again by reliving it, but this time in the position of the causer of trauma, of the one with the power. If there's any relationship that someone who's endured trauma should avoid, it's one in which someone heading towards revictimization meets someone heading towards recidivism. At the time I met her, I thought I had finally, after all those years of discomfort and pain, stumbled onto the first glimmer of luck I'd seen since the morning I'd stepped on that bus. In hindsight, it's almost ridiculously obvious how perfectly I'd been primed, shaped, and molded, how I'd been made the ideal victim of an adult female predator.
The following passage contains descriptions of sexual assault.
Hi. I'm Michael, and over the course of a relationship that lasted under 6 months, from the summer after I turned 15 right up until the day I turned 16, I was raped numerous times. What was in truth the second sexual experience of my lifetime, just as in truth, was my second experience of rape, and it wasn't the last. Now, I have to be careful to say I'm using the word rape here because that is what it feels like to me. I was a legal child, manipulated and coerced into sexual activity by someone who was years older and a legal adult for most of that period. That activity often took place under emotional duress, and from the very start, I lacked either the knowledge or the experience required to provide anything even remotely approaching informed consent. Her age, experience, and knowledge meant there was an extreme imbalance of power. So she steamrolled right over the line between okay and wrong. I'm not formally accusing anyone of the crime of rape, as that term hasn't been defined in Canadian law since 1982. And I'm also not accusing anyone of a crime at all. At the time, I'd been led to believe that a boy couldn't be sexually assaulted by anyone but a man. So as far as I knew, no crime could have occurred. When I finally realized how badly I'd been harmed and actually looked, it turned out that under the backwards laws that applied at the time, there was only one act a 15-year-old couldn't consent to with any adult human who wasn't in a position of authority. And consent didn't yet mean you had to understand what you were consenting to. If it were to happen today in Canada, then legally what happened would be sexual assault. While in many parts of the world it would be statutory rape. But at the time, as far as I can tell, it wasn't legally a crime at all. Morally, though, for me, it was very definitely rape. Rape that, because our culture can be pretty perverse and toxic, regardless of how many people want to stick their fingers in their ear and pretend it isn't, was cheered on by my male peers and at least one of my male teachers, who all thought I'd hit the proverbial jackpot by stumbling across a hypersexual older woman to initiate me and make a man out of me. More thought-terminating cliches. Well, thanks for the advice, guys, but that jackpot devastated my life. Now, again, intellectually at least, I don't blame her. I can't. Because though I didn't know enough at the time to understand what it all meant or how to react to it, and especially not enough to have any idea how to protect myself from it, I was already perceptive enough that I had more than just an inkling of what had been happening to her for most of her childhood and her life. She'd brought me home and introduced me to some of the predators in her life. I'd seen the monsters who shared her home face to face, and from my first day of school, I'd known what that kind of monster looks like, and they terrified me. But the monster I knew wasn't inside the house and present from the day you were born, so I can't really even imagine how much they terrified her. I wasn't old enough, experienced enough, or informed enough to be able to recognize all the red flags in her. The compulsive hypersexuality, the performative exhibitionism, or the spiral of self-destructive choices. But I knew enough to recognize another victim. What I didn't yet know was how to recognize a victim that hadn't chosen to bind the violence within, how to recognize someone that had been re-victimized so badly, so many times, that she'd elected to become a recidivist. Again, it might be my confirmation bias, but I don't think she was bad or evil or had some literal demon inside of her, though a lot of the self-described good Christians in Abbotsford would have said exactly that, and many of them did, including her own father. Instead, I choose to believe there was a deeply wounded self, a self that needed so badly to try and learn the right way to handle the monstrosity that had been visited upon her that she felt compelled to recreate the circumstances of her own horrible injuries in a wrong way that horribly injured me. And she did horribly injure me. Again, I find myself in a place where the actual details are irrelevant. If I could give you the specifics, they're just too specific to me and my story to be of any use to you and yours. But I couldn't give you all the specifics, even if I thought it would help or if I wanted to. You see, it's here at the moment I first re-victimize myself that the real trauma of my life begins. Everything that came before, everything I've described, that's what leads here, what sets the stage. That's all speakable. I have words for that. I can express that. I can feel that and its impact on my life. It's taken me a lifetime, but I can, with a great deal of effort and not a small amount of actual pain, force my body and my mind to walk through the details and parse out the parts that I think can help and say them out loud. And that's good. Maybe for me that leads someday to catharsis. And even if it doesn't, maybe for you or someone else, someday it leads to being able to understand yourself or someone else a little better. But there are details here between the moment we met and my 16th birthday that I still can't get anywhere near. And I mean that in a very literal sense. I've been back to Palmdale as an adult. I don't know the name of the school I was at. I don't know where it was. But I know that if I visited that school today and found the bathroom and even the stall somehow still there, that I could stand there and understand it and be present there. It would hurt. It would hurt a lot. But I could stand there and feel that hurt. There's 5 square miles centered on a specific house in Abbotsford, British Columbia that I would to this day rather die than step within. Just bringing that street the house was up on Google Street View makes me physically ill. And I'm half a planet away. I don't feel even the slightest anger anymore to the man that molested me as a child, but if you gave me the keys to a nuclear arsenal, those 5 square miles and everyone and everything within it would be seared down to the bedrock as soon as the missiles could arrive. I loathe that place. If evil existed, that for me is where it would be found. That's where it would live. That's what my body still forces me to avoid. But it won't let me anywhere near because facing what happened there is just too painful. Not because of what she did to me, but because of what I did to myself.
The following passage contains brief descriptions of multi-generational child abuse.
The thing is, I know that evil doesn't exist. There's no evil there, no actual monsters or demons, and there never was. The idea of evil is just another thought-terminating cliche, and so is the idea of good. There was in reality just a line of sad, pathetic, ignorant people who felt at the time, and to the degree they were capable of thinking, justified in their actions. A line that once more stretched back at least 3 generations, including her. I don't know exactly when or how that family's legacy of multi-generational alcoholism and childhood sexual abuse and what would now be called CPTSD began, but both her father and her mother had clearly received that legacy, and both lacked the tools, the understanding, the knowledge, and frankly the brains necessary to keep it from cascading through them. By the time I arrived on scene, they'd been either abusing or been complicit abusing their daughter for most of her life. And they'd both abused an incredibly warped understanding of Christianity they'd received from one of Abbotsford's warped churches in order to keep doing so again and again. Not one member of her family had above grade school literacy. But in a Bible they couldn't read and never had a hope of understanding. They had found all the thought-terminating cliches needed to justify the sadistic abuse they had both heaped upon her. In their fevered imaginations, the original sin of her genitals somehow required them to hurt her and her genitals in order to keep her on the righteous path. Once they'd justified the unjustifiable, it was her demons that tempted them to go too far, and when they found themselves perversely enjoying their sadism, they imagined more demons to explain the unexplainable. Fending off their real guilt and those imaginary demons required a period of cross-bearing and self-flagellation, and eventually they'd put enough passion into their masochism that their imaginary god would forgive the unforgivable. Of course, it was only a matter of time before the power of their thought-terminating cliches would fail, and her imaginary demons would start speaking to them again, and they'd circle right back to the same real sins. And that, in turn, is exactly what they'd instructed their daughter to do. To cycle in a perpetual fugoid of sadistic actions towards others and masochistic abuse of herself, and she'd never been provided with any other or better example. No evil, no demons, just trauma and reliving and avoidance transmitted through bad faith into revictimization and recidivism, a familial juggernaut that had crushed them and then crushed her. And that's how it ended up crashing into me.
The following passage contains a brief description of sadomasochism.
I can't imagine any circumstance in which any 15-year-old could or should even be able to conceive of the idea of sadomasochism. I know that I'd heard the words sadism and masochism before, that I was aware that they were terms that could one day maybe find a home in my vocabulary. But the ideas were quite divorced from any speakable reality. They were alien, adult words without any discernible meaning to a child. I can't imagine a world in which it would be okay for an adult to ask a 15-year-old to consent to engage in sadomasochistic acts, much less a world that would recognize any consent they gave to those acts as informed. I certainly can't imagine a world in which a 15-year-old child should ever find themselves actually engaging in sadomasochism. I can, however, and very unfortunately, imagine a world in which a 15-year-old boy with my history, introduced by random chance to a woman with hers, ends up learning more about pain than should be humanly possible, because I lived it.
The following passage contains descriptions of dissociation, flashbacks, and triggers.
As I've tried to explain, there's aspects of this I can't look at still. I have the memories, they're just viewed, as it were, through the weird, warped, hard-to-describe looking glass of dissociation. And it was right there, the very first time she took a kid that had never even held hands with a girl, right past my first kiss to way past the point of no return, that I learned how to see the world through a disassociated lens. Something she did, and again, the specifics don't really matter, so perfectly but disturbingly mirrored what had happened on my first day of school, that something in my brain, something I still don't really have words for, just cracked. I had my first, for lack of a better word, live flashback, where part of my mind and body went off and re-experienced in sudden, disjointed images and sensations what had happened to it at 5, while the rest of my mind and body continued to experience what was happening to it in real time at 15. And something about finding a specific metallic taste in my mouth, something repeated in a way that couldn't actually be a repetition, in which I was present both as the one being harmed and the one causing that harm, opened a loop. That's why some of my memories of these actually very small number of months, relative to the expanse of my life, feel so very, very close, so unbearably close, while others feel like a fiction viewed on a theater screen, like one of the Movies I eventually ended up actually helping make during my career before YouTube, where I'm watching something horrific play out in someone else's life, except it's me. And there's some part of me is sure it can't be real, except it is. It won't be until years and years later that I learn to identify my triggers, to give them that name. And it'll be nearly 2 decades before I learn the first useful techniques for grounding myself out of a flashback. But in real time, as a 15-year-old who hadn't been given even the most rudimentary of sex education, I had no way to know that the pain and shock and horror of flashing back and discovering dissociation via both of depersonalization and derealization weren't just the normal, expected, everyday thing you were supposed to feel when someone more experienced touched your body in that way. That's how ignorant I was. I had not been prepared to even the slightest degree to know that what I was experiencing, where I couldn't even recognize my own body, wasn't both normal and something that I should want to experience. The fact that I really, really didn't want to experience any more, that everything that had happened so fast and gone so far that I had blown way past anything that felt safe, and my still unnamed hypervigilance was screaming at the top of its metaphorical lungs to run away as fast as I possibly could, didn't matter. Because very briefly, before things had gotten so scary, she'd held my hand and hugged me and looked at me and touched my body without obvious disgust. And that meant my body was going to trade whatever it was she wanted, no matter how it felt, for the affection it had been starving for and couldn't possibly get enough of. The fact that this all happened in a matter of days after we met tells me, with years of hindsight, that I had gotten caught up in her fugoid. A boundary I didn't even know could be set, hadn't even been discussed. All the messaging we'd both received for years meant that the consent of a boy wasn't required. It was just assumed to be automatic. After I found myself reliving my own acute stress response in such a shocking and vivid manner, after what was really just a small step into preliminary sexual exploration, I fell back once again on fawning. Not consent, definitely not informed consent, but fawning, which to a recidivist might look close enough. In the days and weeks that followed, I kept trying to establish a limit. It was the early, very ignorant days of the HIV and AIDS pandemic, and what little education I'd gotten was that I wasn't yet ready for a literal death sentence. But she kept pushing for more, and I kept purchasing the affection I needed with small, progressively more uncomfortable sacrifices. In my naive child's mind, I thought she was a peer driven by desire. Nothing I'd been exposed to or told about had provided me even the slightest hint that a dangerous female predator driven by need could even exist. Again, I thought my intense discomfort must be normal. So we kept creeping forward, little by little, towards what she told me was the normal and necessary acts of two people in love. I never noticed her switching that to the insinuation that I must not love her if I didn't want to do all the things she wanted, but that I didn't even understand. Nor did I recognize the very real and implicit threat in her telling me she'd be forced to cheat on me if I didn't provide what she needed. Looking back, I'm impressed the small sense of self-worth I had at 15 held out for as long as it did. But it was maybe a little over a month before I'd run out of small transactional sacrifices. I was either going to have to give her what she wanted, or I was going to have to lose what I needed.
The following passage contains brief descriptions of self-harming and sadomasochistic acts.
Unfortunately, what she wanted was pain. Not the worst pain. She wasn't a monster, Again, there are no real monsters. But pain nonetheless. I don't know when or how she stumbled on self-harming, but she taught the rudiments of it to me. At first, just by explaining what she'd done to herself, then by demonstrating it in small ways and then bigger ways, ways that progressively revealed themselves as, for some reason, more and more sexual. And again, how was I supposed to know this wasn't perfectly normal? That's how I learned to first just scratch myself, then to cut myself, then to burn myself. First for someone else's pleasure, and then for my own. I'm sure it's a very foreign idea to most, but to someone with hypervigilance whose attention is always being drawn off to threatening things, using a threatening thing on yourself in a controlled manner, it turns out, is very focusing. All of the anger and the shame within somehow can find a perverse sense of relief in doing these little harms to a body that's already known much larger harms. That's how and why I think self-harming makes its way into the lives of so many people with PTSD and CPTSD, especially women. It somehow feels, albeit incorrectly, like a hint of the catharsis that's supposed to come at the end of recapitulation, and like a small amount of power to the powerless. And that sense of being bad medicine is what makes it so readily accessible, so first compelling and then eventually addicting, what makes it yet another kind of fugoid, her kind of fugoid, which, at least for a time, became my kind of fugoid. Sadly, as I said near the beginning of this video, I have a tendency to go to extremes, and as I've tried to expand on since, the OCD tendencies baked into my brain by virtue of surviving with CPTSD yearns to follow new paths all the way to the end, to ritualize and repeat something until I understand it properly, to recapitulate. As I've grown to understand them, PTSD and CPTSD drive that need to recapitulate, and I believe they drove them in her as well. And so she hurt herself, and then she hurt me, and so I hurt me. I believe we had different but similar experiences of sexuality being forced on us far too young and far too early by adults. And that's what drove the recapitulation in the form of pain tied to sexuality. Unfortunately, and as I explained rather unusually, I also had the experience of death being forced on me far too young and far too early by an adult. I don't just feel the need to recapitulate, I feel the need to recapitulate to the point of self-destruction. Hi, I'm Michael, and a little over a month after we met at 15, on the day I lost what, in light of my first day of school, I can only sarcastically call my virginity, my mind discovered how to make my body a near-perfect masochist. In a moment of severe pain experienced through the tunnel vision of my extremely triggered hypervigilant sensory system, I learned that my body's basic pain response could be effectively disconnected and ignored. That all I had to do was switch on my recently discovered ability to dissociate. Our pain response occurs as an entirely autonomic interaction between sensory receptors in the skin and other organs and the sympathetic nervous system. It's an even earlier and more basic part of our animal physiology than our acute stress response. In fact, it's such an intrinsic part of our too many F's basic animal survival mechanism that we're not supposed to be able to ignore what it's telling us about our environment, as doing so risks serious injury or even death. The pain response is why your hand snaps back from something too hot, long before your brain even begins to register the danger. Like other reflexes, it's vital for our physical moment-by-moment survival that it remains autonomic and isn't stuck waiting for input from our relatively slow-to-respond brains. And she taught me how to teach myself to bring it under somatic control, to turn it off, more or less at will.
The following passage contains descriptions of sexual assault, including bodily injury.
The actual specifics of how she did that, again, aren't important. That moment was bar none the most humiliating, embarrassing, shame-inducing, and traumatic event of my life. What actually happened was horrific, and certainly is not the memory, episodic or visceral, that any human being should be left with of one of those formative boundary experiences that you can only have and pass through once. I shouldn't end up sobbing and crying every time there's a scene of first love just because it's presented as happening somewhere minimally safe where there's an actual bed. But the specific details of that moment aren't what matters, except for one. I don't know what product she'd used to prepare herself specifically, or if she'd figured it out for herself, or by listening to some of the idiotic advice I've learned since was given to girls in that town by parents, teachers, administrators, and especially church leaders. But the detail that does matter is that during what to a normal child with normal senses would have been an extremely intimate and intense moment, the extremely intimate parts of the body of an abnormal child with abnormal senses endured an intense chemical burn. I was terrified. Nothing about that situation was safe, and suddenly I was also in entirely unexpected agony. I was also still so poorly prepared and ignorant of what the experience of sex was supposed to be that in real time, I, again, through this intense, burning pain, thought I'd just discovered another requisite step towards being normal, that this was what I was supposed to feel. The negative self-image that years of CPTSD had already created in me automatically started to berate me as a freak who just wasn't enjoying what everyone around me and all the media we were consuming was insisting I was supposed to be thrilled at. So I needed to fawn. I needed to put on my mask, to pretend to her that I was enjoying what provided me no pleasure whatsoever. No matter how much it hurt, I needed to take it enough to fake it. In my mind, I was already invested. There was no going back to before the pain. And if I didn't keep doing what she wanted, I'd lose the affection, or she'd cheat and put us at risk of STDs or worse. If I faked it, I could at least remain as safe as I was and keep the affection I needed.
The following passage contains description of dissociation in the context of self-harming.
A few minutes ago, I described how something not nameable in my brain had cracked during our first few fumbling days together, and I've explained a bit about how the little pains, the little bits of cutting and burning and other nods to sadomasochism she had introduced me to had helped me focus some of the hypervigilance to narrow its enhanced attention down to a literal knife point. Well, through that crack, all that attention focused on something else I really can't find better words for. Something that just might be unspeakable, because English just doesn't have the words, and we haven't yet invented anything like a programming language for human psychology and physiology. And when I pushed through that crack and touched that something else, it yielded. That's when I first learned to disassociate from pain voluntarily. Not exactly experiencing it third person, and not exactly experiencing it as unreal or fictional. This was and always has been something that hovers, vibrating very uncomfortably somewhere between what I know as depersonalization and derealization. It left me feeling the pain very acutely, but just not caring about it and not having to react to it. It was happening to me. It was real. It just didn't matter. Because I didn't matter. I couldn't matter. If I'd mattered, no force in the universe could or would have possibly placed me on a path that led to that sensation of chemical burning. Once it was over, I wanted to return to it. Not the sex. I'd never want to return to that. I wanted to return to the place where I could be hurt, but not feel. where I could know pain but not give a damn, where I could suffer and just not care about it. And like I said, I've got a need to recapitulate to the point of self-destruction. My childhood from the first day of school on had taught me to take on physical pain as emotional and psychological trauma, and the extreme violence of that first day and all that had come since had left me with an extreme version of what Sigmund Freud, for all his many, many faults, called the death drive. That was Freud's term for the instinct that drives the constant repetition of trauma, both recapitulation and recidivism. And while those two terms, I think, do a better job of conveying what's involved, death drive is certainly an appropriate description of what I found waiting for me that day. The foreshortened future of CPTSD already had me. I already felt like I was already dead inside, and that a significant part of me just wanted the suffering to end. I couldn't yet remember anything clearly, and I certainly couldn't articulate why, but whenever I was forced to sit down in front of a mirror to get my hair cut and I'd have to spend time looking in my own eyes, I knew there was nothing really there looking back out at me. I had never let myself slip into violence because hurting someone else meant hurting something better than me, something worthy of being protected. And if I hit anyone instead of anything, I already knew I'd never stop hitting until someone or something put me down. I had never let myself slip into drugs because I already knew that if a pill or an injection made me feel better, I'd never stop taking them at all. I had never let myself slip into drink, which was an absurdly easy addiction to pick up in Abbotsford, because I'd been lucky enough to have someone tell me that the appeal was it lowered your inhibitions. Do these people really not know what they're inhibiting? Those are three of the easy traps childhood sexual abuse, at least for males, lays in front of you. A shocking number of other truncated boys I have met have lost years, if not their lives, to bullying others, injecting the pain away, or drinking themselves into a stupor. For some lucky reason, something in my brain already knew none of these had any hope of actually working, and it had kept me from slipping down those paths to destruction. Nothing had prepared me for how powerful it felt to touch something else in that brain and be able to feel pain but not give a shit. That path I slipped down without hesitation. That path I was going to learn to run down if I could. Over the next several months of our short relationship, I continued to give her what she needed. It never felt good. There was always pain, and in fact, the pain increased. It was never something I wanted to do. It was just something I endured. What I had wanted was affection to continue, and I'd traded my safety. And now I wanted safety to continue, so I traded my pain. I surrendered my animal instinct to protect myself from pain to a sadomasochist. I naively thought that the pain was supposed to be there, that it was normal, and I'd had no kind of guidance or experience to counter that. Worse, at the time, Abbotsford, British Columbia was full, past brimming, with adults so stupefied by badly misinterpreted and misapplied Christianity that they thought the only morally correct thing to do when a lethal, and at the time untreatable, sexually transmitted disease was literally stalking their children was to preach abstinence, shove their fingers in their ears and their heads up their asses, and pray. In the face of their incessant braying, the few sensible ones were drowned out. I was on my own. I was invested in enduring the pain, and I'd discovered, by accident, the rough tools for doing so. What I needed was practice. What I did over those months makes sense only in light of how the stage had been cleared by meeting a dangerous man on my first day of school, how the neglect and errors of both my parents had assembled the scenery, and how meeting a dangerous woman before I'd even reached the start of maturity had drawn back the curtains and brought up the lights. If I'd tried to explain what arrives on the scene here without explaining any of that, it cannot make sense. That's why I've had to walk you through all of this to get here. Seen through that looking glass, though, what now begins has a terrible kind of cold, horrifying logic.
The following passage contains descriptions of self-harm.
Hi, I'm Michael, and I have tortured another human being. Actually tortured. If my victim could accuse me, I would be culpable for a war crime. But my victim can't accuse me, because he is me. To prepare for the pain she needed me to feel, I needed to feel pain that was worse. So I did. I prepared. My self-harming intensified from the little things, cuts and burns that she'd introduced me to, and it intensified really, really fast. Again, there's details here I shouldn't relate, because these are the literally gory details that can't and won't help, and many of them I couldn't relate even if I wanted to. But there's a very good reason I know, and I mean really know, with a certainty that makes the sun coming up tomorrow look pretty iffy in comparison, that I could sit here in front of you right now and push a nail all the way through my hand if I just decided that I needed to. And I could smile while doing it. I wish that was an exaggeration, but it's not. I know what you have to be prepared to feel to lose 150 pounds in a year multiple times, and that's nothing compared to what you have to be prepared to feel when steel meets muscle, sinew, or bone. Never mind when you finally hit a nerve. I know what I know because I've experienced what I've experienced. Starting from my first day of school, there are quite a few things that I know, that my body especially knows, that I definitely should not know. That certainly no child, and maybe no human, should ever know at all. And here, too, I've got no proof that I can show to the people whose knee-jerk reaction it is to simply refuse to believe that I know what I know. By 15, I knew I needed to sterilize the steel, and I knew where to put it, that it wouldn't be observed. And with all the stretch marks I've built up over the years, the scars don't look like much at all. This isn't my testimony. It couldn't stand up in a court of law. It's just the truth. And the truth is, I maimed myself in order to be able to withstand the pain brought on by whatever it was she'd been taught to do to herself. I injured myself. I was able to disassociate from my body so fully I could wound the parts of it that in theory are supposed to bring pleasure, but had brought me only agony. And again, alien as it may sound, on the inside these acts made a cold kind of sense. They felt justified, or I wouldn't have found myself doing them. Watching myself do the things I did to prepare for her, seen through my hypervigilant eyes, was a real education. Once my brain learned how to flick the disassociation on, my body could endure anything. Once my body understood that pleasure and pain are actually precisely the same sensation, just at different intensity levels, my brain could endure anything. Not without pain, not without cost. There was always a price to be paid. But who cared about the price if it was just me and my grotesque body that were paying it? As summer progressed to autumn, and then autumn to winter, and my 16th birthday approached, all the little trades I just kept making and all the boundaries I just kept slipping past were starting to slice away at what you could call my humanity. I was doing something to myself that was unspeakably shameful. Beyond the pain, it felt utterly wrong, freakish, even disgusting. But I couldn't reconcile that with the fact that all my experience of human sexuality, which again had begun when I was 5, said that anything involving these parts of the body was supposed to involve pain and disgust. I had no one I could go talk to about any of this, and no idea what words I could have used then. there's some parts of it I can't find words for now. During that time, what I eventually learned to call hypervigilance ramped up in intensity to the highest I have experienced outside the immediate moment of an ongoing violent event. When it's at its worst, I lose track of time because I'm paying so much attention that the passage of time seems to slow. When my tunnel vision is at its strongest, what feels like a year for you can feel like a decade or more for me. Those relatively few months in Abbotsford were for me an unending descent into hell as I spiraled into my first truly serious experience of depression.
Depression is, I think, widely enough understood that it doesn't need the sort of formal introduction I gave to PTSD and CPTSD. Most adults alive today, especially with the experiences we've all shared over the past few years, have at least some personal knowledge of depression as a mental illness. Even if it wasn't so serious, they'd think to describe themselves as having been mentally ill. Most people have had, or seen someone else have, a prolonged period of low mood and sadness, of struggling to find or feel hope, pleasure, or motivation, of feeling stuck on a downward gyre spiraling towards the ground. Most people have also found their way out of that gyre, eventually, maybe with the help of a smile or a friend, maybe with the help of a doctor and medication, maybe just with the springtime return of the sun and longer, better days. Not everyone has reached the point where they can't get out of bed, but also can't sleep, or found their appetite or libido just entirely gone. But I would think most can relate to how jarring and frustrating those would be. Fewer have reached the point where suicidal ideation begins, be that fleeting impulses, active planning, or actual action and attempts.
Thank you for listening to my second education, the fourth episode of this 8-part series. My story continues in episode 5, Descent, available now.